Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm very excited for us to continue the reading of Thousand Autumns, also known as Qianxiu by Meng Xi Shi. We'll be digging into chapters 68 through 72 today, so I hope you all enjoy. Chapter 68, Rebirth After Death. They'd fought together beneath the ancient city of Ruoqiang, but that was only because they'd shared a common enemy. Now that they were back on the surface, Changong's party of four might not be able to take the upper hand against Shen Chao, but they held a piece of very important information that they could use against him. Yan Wushi had survived the ambush by those 5 martial experts, and Shen Chao had been the one to rescue him. If this information was revealed, the 5 powers that had ambushed Yan Wushi would definitely not let it go. Right now, Shen Chao was alone. It was impossible for him to fight off that many people. Yes, Changong had implied that he wouldn't reveal their whereabouts, but Shen Chao couldn't trust him so easily now. He naturally chose to be as careful as possible. Better safe than sorry, lest he commit the same mistakes. In order to return to Tu Yuhun, they first had to pass through the small town they'd stopped in before. But Shen Chao didn't want to encounter Changong again, so he didn't rest at an inn within the town. Instead, he found a household to stay in for a few days. This household's conditions were even worse than those of Bana's. They couldn't even offer lamb soup, only fried flatbread, and they didn't have any vacant rooms. They could only spare one. Previously, you said that the jade cistanche is miraculously effective on external injuries, said Shen Chao. As you took that much cistanche with you, isn't there hope that you can fully heal your head injury? Yan Wushi groped around in his sleeve for the cistanche, then passed it to Shen Chao. Here. Shen Chao was surprised. Why me? You were scratched by the apes back underground in Ruoqiang, right? The cistanche's juice is limited and its curative effects mediocre. The fruit is much better. Shen Chao took the cistanche, then suddenly said, You're Yan, not Xieling, aren't you? Yan Wushi was quiet for a moment. How did you know? Shen Chao shook his head. You talk too much. Xieling goes most of the day without saying anything, and from what I know about Yan Wushi, he'd never inconvenience himself in the slightest. Though your personalities all have their differences, some intrinsic qualities never change. When we were at Bana's place, if there was lamb soup to eat, Xieling wouldn't touch the flatbread. And if there was only flatbread, Xieling would still endure and refuse to eat while remaining silent. But just now, though your face betrayed your displeasure, you still partook of the flatbread. Yan Wushi sputtered a laugh. Ah, Qiao. I had no idea that you paid so much attention to our every move. I'm truly overwhelmed and flattered. If I don't pay close attention, I fear that a fool like myself will get duped again, and I won't even know it. His tone was leisurely and placid as he spoke these words, without even a shred of resentment. How much treachery had he suffered in this world, had been hammered down upon him in order for him to forge such a chivalrous and sentimental heart? Yan Wushi gave a slight sigh. If you're a fool, Ah Chao, then no intelligent people exist in this world. Shen Chao burst out laughing. Thank you for your praise. Then Yan Wushi asked sweetly, Who do you like more, me or Xieling? Shen Chao froze a little, then knit his brows and said mildly, Whether it's you or Xieling or some other personality, you're all just a fragment of Yan Wushi's inner demons. Since you've already obtained the silk piece, it'll just be a matter of time before he repairs the flaw in his demonic core. Once that happens, all of you will disappear while Yan Wushi will still be Yan Wushi. Who I like isn't important. Yan Wushi smiled. You're correct. In the end, we are all born from Yan Wushi and are joined to him, so it's impossible for us to exist separate from this body. So you must like Xieling the most, because Xieling is the least like Yan Wushi, correct? Shen Chao didn't answer his question. Instead, he sighed. Back in Ruoqiang, we never got a good night's rest. Let's sleep first. I'm tired as well. He didn't wait for a reply, just closed his eyes and crossed his legs as he began to meditate. In the days he'd spent inside Ruoqiang's ancient city, though every step had been fraught with danger, Shun Chao had also gained new experiences. Those apes weren't as sly and calculating as humans, but they were inexhaustible and far more aggressive. While fighting them, Shun Chao had often felt like he was wandering between life and death, and every time he escaped that grisly fate, his comprehension of martial arts would rise to the next level. His initial defeat at Banbu Peak had been wholly unexpected. The moment he'd fallen from the cliff, Shun Chao's heart had been full of anger and disbelief, just like any other person's would be. But after witnessing all sorts of people and affairs, he'd tempered himself a true tender heart and could even face life and death situations calmly. This type of mindset was reflected in his swordplay. When he'd used the Azure Wave sword technique in the past, even if he could endlessly change and wield them with ease, they lacked the confidence born from experience with life and death. But when he used them now, the moves poured out with a transcendental grace. As the Juyang strategy's true qi rebuilt his meridians, it and his personality quietly and subtly actualized each other. Only when a person's mind is truly detached and tranquil can they understand the subtlest, most wondrous aspects of nature's beauty. The endless red dust of the human world sees a lone crane soaring high and far. The heavenly Tao is unfeeling, and I alone have obtained it. An outsider might notice that his aura grew more transcendental day after day. Even dressed in an ordinary Taoist robe, he looked more divine than the gods or immortals themselves. To Shun Chao, this sensation brought him into a deeply profound state, awake yet sleep, in between dream and reality. He could unconsciously sense and know everything around him. The sleeping households, the cold moon that hung outside, the dogs asleep by the fences, the breeze as it rustled the branches, and even inside his room. Yan Wushi. Shun Chao suddenly opened his eyes. The man who was supposed to be asleep was staring at him, eyes wide open. Shun Chao was somewhat uncertain and asked, Xieling? Yan Wushi made a sound of confirmation and didn't blink. How come it's you? I wanted to come out, so I did, said Yan Wushi. Though this answer was a little cryptic, Shun Chao actually understood him. He meant that the Xieling personality's strong obsessive tendencies had allowed him to take over for now. Words that were brief yet complete, with intermittent pauses. That was indeed Xieling's style. I should thank you, said Shun Chao, for coming back to bring me out of Ruoqiang. But you'd already switched to Yan by the time we were out, so I had to wait until now to tell you. No need, said Yan Wushi. So he said, but his eyes remained on Shun Chao. Lacking the erratic moods, without an icy aloofness hidden within mocking smiles, Xieling's personality actually became more distinctive. Shun Chao felt that if Yan Wushi had been Xieling from the start, many things probably wouldn't have happened. But there were no what-ifs in life. Yan Wushi was Yan Wushi. Xieling was a part of Yan Wushi. But Yan Wushi would never be Xieling. When I was training with the Juyang strategy on Xuandu Mountain in the past, says Shun Chao, it always felt like I was looking at a beauty through a veil. I know that she was beautiful, but I couldn't see her clearly, and there was nothing I could do about it. Only after I lost all my martial arts in my battle with Sang Jingxing did I realize what it truly meant to fight your way out of certain death and be reborn. By starting over, I was able to use the Juyang strategy to its greatest effect. But in this world, giving up everything is easier said than done. Even if they knew that the Juyang strategy is capable of reshaping one's meridians, would the likes of Dou Yanshan and Duen Wenyang be willing to give up all the prowess they'd cultivated over the decades to start again? Yan Wushi didn't reply. Shun Chao didn't need him to either. He smiled, then continued. Even without hearing it from them personally, I know that very few people would be willing to do so. Leaving aside others to talk about myself, even my past self, before I was forced to give up all my martial arts, would have been plagued with misgivings. But if your heart is full of worries, even if you were forced to destroy all your martial arts, you wouldn't be able to properly cultivate with the Juyang strategy. There's a Buddhist verse that says, "One must throw away their life and embrace death before they can give up everything and achieve true peace." But demonic and Taoist cores are fundamentally different. You haven't lost your martial arts either. You only need to repair the flaw, so it should be much easier for you than it was for me. Why are you saying this? Shunchao said, "You once said that only an evenly matched opponent was qualified to be your equal. Back then, I didn't have those qualifications. Even my current self cannot compare to your past self. With your abilities, repairing the demonic core's flaw is only a matter of time, and you will certainly recover your martial arts one day." What I said just now were the insights that I had while cultivating with the Juyang strategy. I hope they can benefit you. As one who follows the martial path, I also hope for one day when we can have a proper and straightforward battle. "I'm Xie Ling," said Yan Wushi. "I know," said Shunqiao, "but you're not the only person who can hear these words. Your other personalities can hear them too." Yan Wushi gazed at him silently. Shunqiao was already used to this. It matched the reaction he expected of Xie Ling. He patted the other man's shoulder. "It's late. Sleep." After another long moment, that person finally listened and closed his eyes. Shunqiao also closed his eyes, then returned to resting cross-legged. After a few days, Shunqiao reckoned that Chunggong's party should have been in a hurry to return to Qi, so they likely wouldn't stay in Tuyuhuan for too long. By this point, they might have already reached the royal capital or even left Tuyuhuan entirely. So he left the small town and returned to the royal capital of Tuyuhuan together with Yan Wushi. It'd been a while since they last saw it. Sure enough, they didn't meet Chunggong's party along the way. The coiling dragon assembly had ended quite some time ago, so the Central Plains martial artists had already departed, greatly lowering their risk of Yan Wushi being discovered. But Shunqiao still felt their characteristics were too distinct and conspicuous. If they continued south, they might end up with more troubles. Hence, he exchanged his Taoist robe for common Han ones and brought back a set of women's clothes together with some cosmetics. He placed them before Yan Wushi. Yan Wushi just stared at him silently. Shunqiao gave a light cough. "Your appearance is too striking. It's better to disguise yourself." Yan Wushi didn't answer, but his expression was clearly asking, "Then why aren't you putting on the outfit?" "You can wear a veil once you change into women's clothing. If others think you're a woman, they'll avoid looking at you so as not to arouse suspicion. If you continue to dress as a man, the moment you meet observant types like Do Yanshan and Duen Wenyang, they'll still be able to pick up some clues. In order to keep from stirring up trouble before you meet up with Huan Yue sect, women's clothing is the safest choice." The two of them stared awkwardly at each other for a while. Shunqiao frowned. "Will you wear it or not?" Yan Wushi shook his head. "If I don't wear it, what will you do?" "I'll seal your acupoints, help you into the outfit, and then rent a carriage and take you that way. That might be somewhat more painful, but it'll at least save me quite a bit of trouble." Yan Wushi lowered his lashes. "I'll wear it." "Good boy." Shunqiao was pleased, thinking that Xie Ling really was the easiest to persuade. The white hair peppering his temples had to be dyed black, but his hair could remain in a bun. No change was required here, since many women also wore this hairstyle. His eyebrows had to be trimmed slightly, his cheeks and lips dabbed with rouge. A general look was good enough. They didn't need to be particular about the details. Then he changed into the outfit and embroidered shoes. Though his figure looked somewhat strange and his expression was stiff and cold, an air of handsome beauty remained about his features, which had its own charm. Shunqiao saw how tense he was and laughed. "Don't be afraid. In the past, whenever the portraits of our forefathers at Xuandu Mountain began to fade, I was the one who'd touch them up. Touching up portraits and touching up makeup. Though not the same, they still share certain similarities." Once he was finished, he stood and gave Yan Wushi a once-over, then nodded. Not bad. Would you like to see yourself in the mirror? But the other man had no interest in even glancing at the bronze mirror. He went and put the veil on straight away. What you couldn't see couldn't hurt you. Chapter 69, Tangren. By the time the two of them returned to Tu Yuhuan's royal capital, winter had already arrived. There were far fewer merchants passing through here to the other countries of the western regions now, and the entire capital seemed completely different from when they'd left, assuming a cold and lonely appearance. "This is only temporary," said the street peddler selling Tangren. "Traveling west in the winter is difficult, so many merchants set off during autumn and return the following spring. Once winter is over, more people will show up again." He was a Han, but 10 years ago he'd met a Tu Yuhuan maiden while passing by this place with a group of traveling merchants. Afterward, he'd married and settled down here to have a family. Shunchao had a natural approachability, the power to make everyone around him extremely comfortable, as if they were basking in the spring breeze. Previously, Yan Wushi had been standing in front of his Tangren stall for a while, but the peddler hadn't spoken to him. Then Shunchao walked over and asked a couple of questions, and just like that, the peddler started chatting with him like he'd met an old friend from his hometown. "There are actually quite a few Han people in the city," the peddler told him. "Even the royal and noble families of Tu Yuhuan speak the Han language and wear Han clothing. But since we're in the western regions, most people aren't willing to leave their native land and come here." Shunchao smiled. That's true. Your wife must have been amazingly beautiful and wise to make you stay. From the way you talk, you have to be a fairly well-read scholar, yet you were willing to stay in this distant land for her, thousands of miles away from your hometown. Seeing such deep love between spouses truly makes one jealous." Hearing Shunchao's praise, the peddler scratched his head, both embarrassed and proud. "Thank you for your compliments. I just went through a couple of years' worth of private tutoring when I was young. I'm not much of a scholar at all. And where did you return from? You look all worn from travel. Was it with some traveling merchants to spend the winter?" Shunchao said, "We've been on the road for a while, traveling west. We saw how the weather was growing colder and didn't dare to keep going, so we returned. We heard that the Coiling Dragon Assembly took place in the capital some days ago. I imagine it's already over?" "It's been over for a while," said the peddler. "Everyone's already left. Thought it was busy this year? A lot of people from the Jianghu came with their swords and sabers. Since I make Tangren, I didn't get much business from them. In fact, during the days after they arrived, people would draw their swords against each other from time to time. I was so scared I hid at home for a couple of days." "In that case, the city no longer has any Jianghu practitioners?" "None. After the Coiling Dragon Assembly ended, they all left. Did you see those inns? They were all jam-packed before. It's much better now. Even after lowering their prices, they can't fill their rooms." "However, I heard that Qi was destroyed by Zhou. Maybe the number of traveling merchants heading west next year will drop even further." At first, Shunchao had been worried that once news of Yan Wushi's death spread, Yuan Yong's life would be in danger. But he hadn't anticipated that such a huge development would have taken place in the few months since they'd left Chang'an. He couldn't resist throwing a glance at the man beside him. Yan Wushi was wearing a veil, concealing his expression, so Shunchao couldn't see it clearly. "Qi was destroyed?" asked Shunchao. "That quickly? Did they not put up any resistance?" The peddler sighed. "Who knows? Perhaps the Zhou army was simply too strong. Thinking about it now, my old home was in Qi. It's unfortunate. Even though I've been living far away in Tu Yuhuan for years, I still heard news about how capricious and foolish our ruler was. But I could never have imagined that such a large nation could really disappear. Just like that." "The unification of the North will still be beneficial to the people," said Shunchao. "Once things quiet down, the number of merchants traveling to and from the western regions will only increase, not decrease." Another smile spread over the peddler's face. "That's true. I'll take your word for it then. I'll be waiting for the day the Central Plains knows true peace. Then I'll take my wife and children back to my hometown." He kept Shunchao in a conversation for quite a while and still wished to continue, but then he saw how Yan Wushi was silently standing to the side, seemingly staring at the Tangren. Only then did he remember his business, and he quickly laughed. This lady must be your wife, then. Is she also from Tu Yuhun? She's my younger sister, said Shunchao. Wife, said Yan Wushi. Shunchao and Yan Wushi's eyes met. Shunchao guessed that Yan Wushi had done it on purpose due to his dissatisfaction at being made to dress up like a woman. But he couldn't say too much in front of an outsider. He could only give a light cough and throw in a belated explanation. This is my cousin. She's a bit immature, so please don't take offense. It would have been better if he hadn't explained. The moment he did, the peddler instantly imagined a story about a pair of cousins in forbidden love eloping to a faraway land. He quickly nodded repeatedly. I understand, I understand. Shunchao was completely baffled. What do you understand? Even I don't understand. Beside him, Yan Wushi pointed at a Tangren. I want this. His voice was deep, completely unlike a woman's, but the peddler didn't think too much of it. After all, sandstorms were rampant outside the Great Wall. Some Tuyuhuan maidens also had hoarse voices because of it. The peddler's spirits rose after hearing Yan Wushi's words. What would your esteemed self like? I can make anything. Horse, cow, sheep, said Yan Wushi. Shunchao didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Just one should be enough. What are you going to do with so many? Then I want one, said Yan Wushi. The peddler smiled. All right, of course. Would you like a horse, a sheep, or a cow? Yan Wushi pointed to Shunchao. Him. The peddler started. Huh? Make one of him, said Yan Wushi. Shunchao had never been in a romantic relationship before, but the misunderstanding from earlier, combined with the peddler's dubious expression, was enough for him to know where the peddler had gone wrong. He said to the peddler, She's only joking. How about a sheep? No, said Yan Wushi. I want him. Then he asked the peddler, Is that all right? The peddler seemed to sense a burning gaze beneath the veil. He quickly said, Yes, of course. Of course it's all right. Shunchao held his forehead. The peddler was indeed quite skilled. His hands moved as he talked, and within 15 minutes, a lively Tangren was born right before their eyes. Since it had been shaped from molten syrup, the facial features remained indistinct. But its pose and bearing, walking forward with a long cloth bag over its back, really did capture some of Shunchao's charm. Shunchao laughed. As expected of a professional, this level of craftsmanship must have taken at least 10 years to hone. The peddler let out a small laugh, pleased with the praise. Not at all. Yan Wushi took the Tangren and brought it before his veil. Then he bit off the head with a snap and started crunching it inside his mouth. Shunchao could only watch in silence. To avoid attracting too much of the peddler's curiosity and attention, Shunchao handed over the money, then quickly hauled Yan Wushi away. Zhou vanquishing Qi meant that the north would soon be unified. Neither the Chun dynasty nor the Goktur Khaganate would want to see Zhou grow larger without opposition. They definitely want to kill Yuan Yong by any means possible. This was because the crown prince, Yuan Hun, showed no signs of being an enlightened ruler even now. If Yuan Yong died, Zhou would become a dragon without a head, a nation without a leader, and it would soon scatter like sand. Following this speculation, Yan Wushi had to appear in Chang'an as quickly as possible. He had to show up at Yuan Yong's side and demonstrate to everyone that he was still alive. Yan Wushi coming out unscathed and healthy after an ambush by 5 of the world's best martial artists would raise his reputation to new heights. Whether it was a good or a bad reputation didn't matter. Everyone would hesitate in fear of his might, and no one would dare make an attempt on Yuan Yong's life lightly. However, the problem was that the current Yan Wushi, though not dead, had been gravely injured. The flaw in his demonic core was still there, but the bigger issue was his massive personality shift. He'd even split off into multiple personalities, and some of those actually spoke ill of himself. Ordinary people could be deceived, but when it came to the smarter ones, there was a decent chance they'd notice. As for brilliant men like Do Yan Shan and Duen Wen Yang, That went without saying. A single glance would be enough for them to realize that something was wrong. While Shen Qiao pondered this, Yan Wushi had already finished gnawing at the Tangren's waist and was moving on to the thighs. Seeing him like this, who would believe that this was Yan Wushi? If he acted like this in front of Duen Wenyang and the others, they definitely beat him until even the dregs were gone. Shen Qiao couldn't resist heaving a sigh and pulled him into a tavern. Once they were seated, he asked, "You heard what the man said just now. Any thoughts?" Yan Wushi lifted the veil and shoved the rest of the Tangren into his mouth, crunching. He expressionlessly looked at Shen Qiao, his cheeks moving as he chewed. Even Shen Qiao, with his incredible self-restraint, couldn't help how his mouth twitched at the sight. "Even if you're Xieling right now, you should still understand my words, right?" Yan Wushi made a sound of assent. Then what are your plans? Should I take you directly back to Chang'an and look for your disciples?" "No," said Yan Wushi. He seemed very unwilling to talk and was even frowning because of it. After some time, he finally said, "Send them a message." Shen Qiao nodded. "All right. We can wait for Bian Yanmei to receive your message before meeting up with him. Then you can discuss a plan of action together. Huanyue's sect has a fair amount of influence in Qi. Once we enter Qi, we should be able to find one of your members, right? How should we go about sending a message?" "I don't remember," said Yan Wushi, meaning that Xie Ling didn't remember. Once again, Shen Qiao wanted to sigh. "Never mind. This matter can wait until later. It won't be too late to discuss it after we return to Northern Zhou." While they were talking, the waiter had already brought over the food. This place was much nicer than the small town they'd stayed at earlier, and there was more than just lamb soup and fried flatbread to order. It was the middle of winter, yet there was a hint of Manchurian wild rice on their plates, a rare sight. The tavern sat in the middle of the market, and their seats were near the second-floor window. When they looked down, they saw a great many people buying and selling, all calling out their prices. And right below them was a street performer, holding a giant weasel hairbrush in his arms. As he flipped and leapt, the wet hairbrush tip left light and graceful marks over the ground. A closer look showed that he was mimicking the calligraphy from the Orchid Pavilion by the Western Jin Dynasty's Wang Xizhi. The performance was both refreshing and unique. Soon, it drew in many people, who all gathered to watch. Not everyone could read or understand the contents, but the performers' moves were elegant and nimble, and each of them elicited a chorus of cheers. Shen Qiao saw that Yan Wushi was watching attentively, so he too tossed the performer a careless glance. However, when he saw the writing left by the weasel hairbrush dragging over the ground, it plucked at something in his heart. Suddenly, he made a mental connection, and a flash of insight came over him. The man's performance couldn't be considered martial arts. They were only some rough street moves with punches and kicks. But the man was clever, and he'd combined them with the dance styles of the Western regions. The result was that he seemed to be dancing, but also to be performing tricks, all while writing characters in between. The bystanders found it refreshing and amusing. Even if the richer ones only gave a few coppers, it was still enough to feed a performer for the day. But the man didn't just put on a perfunctory and half-hearted performance because the crowd was only watching for fun. The Orchid Pavilion characters he wrote out on the uneven ground using the weasel hairbrush were quite mediocre. If this had been the Central Plains, countless professional calligraphers would have instantly appeared to sneer at him. However, he wrote every stroke with complete focus, to the point of forgetting himself. He was completely immersed within his own dance, and he stared unswervingly at the ground, paying careful attention to the strength behind each stroke and the structure of each character. The martial path was incredibly profound and abstruse. It selected for talent, diligence, and even more for comprehension. Sometimes, days or even years of painstaking training would bring no progress. But there would be moments of great advancement, too, when understanding would dawn and the practitioner would instantly enter a new echelon. And right now, as Shen Qiao watched the performer's every movement, a scene automatically sprang into his mind. In this scene, the performer had become Shen Chao, and within his hand wasn't a brush, but a sword. The greatest virtue is like water. Water benefits all things without demanding anything in return. It resides in places disliked by men, and therefore it comes closest to the Tao. The waves of the oceans, the crags of the mountains, the great Tao exists everywhere, melded formlessly into the secular world. Like drifting clouds or flowing waters, he danced through a set of sword techniques. The moves were incredibly close to the azure wave sword techniques, but Shen Chao knew very well that they were different. They were techniques he created himself. Slowly, that set of sword techniques took form in his mind, and Shen Chao almost forgot everything around him. He even forgot that he was still inside a tavern, forgot that Yan Wushi was still beside him. He immediately leapt to his feet and bounded outside, sweeping toward the city outskirts with such speed he practically flew. He could already wait no longer. He had to actualize this set of sword techniques. Chapter 70. Comprehending the Sword. For someone who'd achieved the pinnacle of martial arts, even fallen leaves and drifting flowers could become weapons. So once they reached a certain echelon, the moves themselves became extraneous. They might no longer be the key to victory. But that didn't mean that the moves were entirely dispensable. As the saying went, words are the voice of the mind. Internal and external cultivation came as a pair. Possessing only a body of peerless internal cultivation was equivalent to having a mountain of treasures without knowing how to use them. Tifengge was a martial prodigy in his generation, and he keenly understood that knowing too many moves would confuse and overwhelm a swordsman. They wouldn't know where to start using them. It was better to abstract them, reducing the complicated to the simple. Hence, he'd taken all the swordplay techniques of Xuandu Mountain and consolidated them, and in the end, only 2 sets remained. One of them was the famous Azure Wave sword technique. Xuandu Mountain's sword moves integrated the Taoist concepts of spiritual stillness and non-interference, as well as the Taoist principle of nature. It emphasized agility and elegance, using stillness to defeat movement, and that counterattacking was the key to victory. Shen Chao's disposition just happened to be a perfect match for these, allowing him to achieve fantastic results with minimal practice. But after he began cultivating with the Zhuyang strategy's true Qi, his original sword moves gradually became a poor fit. The Zhuyang strategy's true Qi didn't consist of Taoist principles alone, but also the essence of Confucianism and Buddhism, intelligent efficiency from the Confucians, and unyielding vigor from the Buddhists. Yet the Azure Wave sword technique couldn't express either of these. However, while all things in the world had their differences, they still shared some similarities. Just now, when he'd been watching the performers dancing in calligraphy, Shen Chao noticed that though the man was in a busy market and performing for money, he'd seemed unconcerned with appealing to the audience. Instead, he was wholeheartedly immersed in what he was doing, completely engrossed as he danced up a storm. The dance styles of the Western regions were bold and unrestrained, but calligraphy was a delicate art. By combining the two, they'd created a strange harmony of strength and softness. Onlookers might only find his movements lovely to look at, but Shen Chao had used them to attain further understanding, realizing an entirely new set of sword techniques. At this moment, he rose as his sword fell, his sword glare blazing freely. It was winter, and the trees stood bare, all things in a state of wither and decay. But this man and this sword swept and scoured, twisting and turning. Sometimes they were like the drizzling spring winds, so soft they seemed insubstantial. Other times they were more unyielding than even the Vajra, ferocious and harsh. The warm spring sun, the clear summer moon were all contained within. The whistling autumn breeze, the bleak winter grass, were inconspicuous and unharmed. The withered mountains and streams, the surging Yangtze and Han, were all conceived by nature. Ethereal light rippled, converging and diverging, at times dark, at times bright. Within this he danced, poised like a crane on the verge of taking flight. The heart is within the sword, and the sword is within the man. Forgetting both myself and the world, I achieve perfect clarity. As if the withered trees around him had sensed this, wherever the sword chi touched, they fell one after another, and within the cold, hardened mud beneath him was scored slash after slash of sword chi, some deep and some shallow, some short and some long. Occasionally, the dead leaves, as if intimidated by the sword chi, would flutter from the branches, but they did not fall to the ground. Instead, they whirled around the sword chi. Suddenly, the tip of his sword trembled, and the dead leaves quivered alongside it. Then, one after another, they shot forward with tremendous speed, all straight into the trunk of a tree 10 yards away, embedded so deep within that no part of them was visible. A martial expert channeling their true chi into fallen leaves and flowers wasn't unusual. However, manipulating leaves with the sword went a level beyond that. Shanhe Tongbei droned and hummed, seemingly in accordance with its master's rippling emotions. Faintly within lay the majestic mountains and rivers, the roaring of galloping tempests. Its sword glare wasn't blinding, but only wrapped thinly around the blade, much gentler than it had been before. But this fine veneer of sword glare moved with Shen Qiao's will, at times present, at times hidden, fluttering alongside it. Having gone through the entire set of techniques, Shen Qiao sheathed his sword and straightened, then released a long breath. The agitation within his heart had yet to subside, and blood roiled within his stomach. He was close to nausea. He knew very well that this was because his echelon of sword heart was still unstable. His internal energy wasn't in harmony with his movements, so the sword chi had backlashed. During his duel with Kunye, his achieving the echelon of sword heart had stunned and terrified his opponent. But it had been much like a shooting star streaking through the night, a flash, and it was gone. Sometimes he'd been able to see it, yet he was still unable to grasp it properly. Only now, after great difficulty, did he get his first true glimpse of the gate. Martial arts practitioners had but one lifelong quest: to make continual progress and achieve the next level. Hence, the unskilled looked up to the experts, and the experts wished to climb ever higher. When there was no end to knowledge, how could there be an end to the martial path? There were 4 echelons of the sword: sword chi, sword intent, sword heart, and sword spirit. To many people, sword spirit only existed in legend. Other than Gan Jiang and Moye of the Warring States period, who'd thrown away their lives for the sword, attaining the echelon of sword spirit in exchange for their lives, no one had been able to achieve this echelon since ancient times. As for the echelon of sword heart, in the last few decades, Tao Hongjing and Qi Fengge were the only ones to achieve this in the entire world, and both of them were gone. In the end, Tao Hongjing and Qi Fengge had passed on into history. But Shen Qiao was still alive and present. Shen Qiao sheathed his sword and stood in place, slowly adjusting his disordered breathing. The carefree, intoxicating sensation slowly faded, and he suddenly remembered a very important matter. He'd left Yan Wushi at the restaurant. Oh no, thought Shen Qiao, and he immediately dashed to the city. Yan Wushi didn't have a single copper. With Shen Qiao gone, if the waiter came up and asked him to pay, even if the relatively harmless Xie Ling were in charge, it was still difficult to predict how he'd react. With this in mind, Shen Qiao quickened his pace further. In the blink of an eye, he'd returned to the tavern. Sure enough, near the second-floor window, 7 or 8 people stood around where he'd been sitting. Among them was the tavern keeper and waiters, along with other customers. Yan Wushi was surrounded by gazes, but he remained completely still. His expression wasn't visible beneath the veil, but at a glance, it seemed like he was meekly standing there after being scolded, too afraid to move. Shen Qiao quickly walked toward them. "I'm terribly sorry. Something suddenly came up just now, and I had to leave for a moment. How much is it? I'll pay. The tavern keeper was an ethnic Han. He looked at Shunqiao the way one would look at their savior and said with a pained expression, "My good gentleman, we're only a small business. Being in a foreign country is already hard for us, so we really didn't want to stir up any trouble. This little lady didn't bring any money, and you weren't back yet, so my lowly self decided to write it off as bad luck and let it go. But then the little lady refused to leave, and the moment we asked, she... Shun Qiao followed the tavern owner's finger to look at the table to see the cup shattered into fine powder and a pair of chopsticks stabbed into the wood. The corner of his lips twitched. Faced with this scene, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He apologized over and over before paying for both the meal and the ruined tableware. Then he dragged Yan Wushi away. You're still Xieling, correct? Shun Qiao asked. Shun Qiao gave a light cough. Sorry, when I saw that man dance, I suddenly gained new insight. He brought Yan Wushi downstairs. The man was still dancing, and though it was a freezing winter day, his face was soaked in sweat. One could see how hard he was working. Unfortunately, the copper bowl before him held only a scant few coins. The number of onlookers had dropped as well. Shun Qiao took out almost half the coppers he had on him and placed them into the bowl. The man gaped and repeatedly bowed to them. Shun Qiao gave him a slight nod, then left with Yan Wushi. After a couple of steps, Yan Wushi suddenly said, "You gave too much." Shun Qiao laughed. It's the unknowingly planted willow that grants one shade. If anything, I feel like I gave too little. But we don't have much money on us right now, so this was all I could give. Yan Wushi said no more. He spoke even less than usual. Shun Qiao wondered if he was still unhappy and panicked due to his abandonment earlier. After all, Xie Ling was still different from the real Yan Wushi. Shun Qiao smiled and apologized. Are you angry? Don't be upset. I was wrong. I shouldn't have left you like that. I was completely focused on my new insight and wanted to realize those techniques right away, so I became negligent. Would you like something to eat or to play with? I'll buy it for you. Yan Wushi was silent for a moment, then said, Tangren. That single word gave Shun Qiao pause. The moment he said Tangren, Shun Qiao began to regret what he'd said. But this was a grave he dug for himself. Since he made the suggestion, he had to fulfill it. So, he could only bring Yan Wushi back to the original Tangren station. The peddler recognized them and smiled, surprised. You're back! Do you want another Tangren? Shun Qiao said awkwardly, Yes. Please give us another. 2, said Yan Wushi. Shun Qiao acceded. Then 2, please. No one would refuse money when it came knocking on their door. So the peddler beamed, and in a flurry of movements, 2 Tangren were shaped and born. Yan Wushi held one in each hand, crunching as he ate. All Shun Qiao could do was pretend he heard nothing as he brought Yan Wushi to an inn. He requested a main room. As before, Yan Wushi slept on the bed while Shun Qiao sat and meditated. Shun Qiao's strength was gradually recovering, so whenever he had the time, he'd substitute meditation for sleep, as the former gave him the opportunity to practice martial arts on top of resting. Shun Qiao said to Yan Wushi, Since that silk piece can be used to repair the demonic core, you should... Halfway through, he found himself unable to continue, because Yan Wushi, veil already removed, had finished one Tangren and was now licking the head of the other one. He licked until the head and face of the Shun Qiao Tangren was glistening bright. What are you doing? I'm a little fool, said Yan Wushi innocently, so I'll eat this one slowly. It wasn't like Shun Qiao could say, Can you not lick it? Because that would sound even stranger. After all, the other person was eating candy. Shun Qiao would just come off as oversensitive. He could only choose to not look. What he couldn't see couldn't hurt him, and finished the rest of his sentence. The Central Plains are different from the Western regions. Once we enter Zhou, our whereabouts will be exposed sooner or later. Now that you have the silk piece, repairing your demonic core is only a matter of time. You should ponder it whenever you're free. After he finished, he couldn't help but shake his head and laugh a little. Well, if you were the real Yan Wushi, you wouldn't need me to press you about this. If the demonic core is repaired, said Yan Wushi suddenly, Xieling may vanish. Shen Chao withdrew his smile and became quiet too. A long moment after, he sighed. But you can't stay like this for the rest of your life. Maybe Xieling is willing, but Yan Wushi might not be. Xieling was a part of Yan Wushi, but Yan Wushi would never have returned to save Shen Chao after freeing himself from danger. Perhaps deep within every stone-hearted person was a hidden trace of gentleness, and even though it was infinitesimally small, that gentleness had been allotted to Xieling, and he'd concentrated all of it on Shen Chao, the person he trusted the most. However, when the day came that Xieling had to vanish, would that trace of gentleness also disappear into nothing? And would Yan Wushi remain that selfish, detached Huanyue sect leader who couldn't be swayed by anything? The other man watched him with pitch-black eyes, his single-minded attention evident, untainted by impurities. This was something Shen Chao had never seen in any of Yan Wushi's other personalities. This was Xieling, not Yan Wushi. He told that to himself, then walked over to him and lightly caressed the top of his head. The man let him do it. He only raised his chin a little, as if rubbing back against Shen Chao. This was something only Xieling would do. Shen Chao's heart suddenly melted, turning tender. And within its tenderness surged an inexplicable sorrow. Under the effects of the jade sistanche, his head injury had begun to gradually heal, but repairing the damaged meridians within his body wasn't something that could be achieved in such a short amount of time. Right now, Yan Wushi's personality was unstable, so he couldn't focus on cultivating. For example, when Xieling's personality was dominating his body, like now, his desires would drop to their lowest, and even his thinking seemed to become simpler. A single Tangren was enough to satisfy him. "Do you still have the silk piece with you?" asked Shen Chao. "Let me see." The other man pulled out the silk from his lapel and handed it to him. Shen Chao took it and observed it intently. His eyes narrowed. The words written upon it were indeed related to the martial arts of the demonic sects. Back then, Tao Hongjing might have read Rebirth sect's martial arts records. It was around 1,000 characters long, and most of it was commentary on their martial arts along with their own realizations. There are no specific tricks or secrets on how to train with the demonic arts. Due to his poor vision, after he managed to finish reading using the feeble candlelight, his eyes were sore and painful, almost to the point of tears. "There's nothing here about repairing the demonic core's flaw, right?" A little confused, he passed the silk piece back. "There is," said Yan Wushi. "Where?" asked Shen Chao. Yan Wushi shook his head. After a moment, he added, "I don't know, but he does." Meaning that Xieling didn't know, but his original self did. Shen Chao nodded and didn't press further. Once Yan Wushi was asleep, he found a mattress and crossed his legs for meditation. Moonlight poured down like water. It was getting late. Even the baying of the dogs in the distance had disappeared. As the world sank into slumber, a tranquil quiet spread forth from within to without. On the bed, the occupant's sleep was fitful. Occasionally, his body would struggle a little. Shen Chao noticed his movements and opened his eyes. He walked up to examine him. "Xieling," he called quietly. The man's brows were tightly pinched. It seemed like he was deep within a nightmare. Shen Chao reached out to check his forehead, but before he could touch the skin, the man's eyes suddenly snapped open. This wasn't Xieling. Seeing his gaze, Shen Chao immediately became alarmed. He withdrew his hand and backed up. But Yan Wushi moved far faster than he'd expected. His body shot up like a demon, and he made a lightning-quick grab for Shen Chao's face. "Sect Leader Yan, it's me!" Shen Chao shouted. But it was to no avail. The other man ignored him, attacking viciously and with deadly ruthlessness. Yan Wushi might have been heavily injured, but that didn't mean he'd lost his martial arts. Shun Chao suddenly became aware of this point. Because Yan Wushi rarely attacked before, it'd given him the wrong impression. However, even if it weren't the real Yan Wushi, he wouldn't start attacking someone without regard to their identity the moment he opened his eyes. He was obviously confused and mentally disoriented. Shun Chao suddenly recalled Bana mentioning that Yan Wushi had once strangled her, but afterward, Shun Chao had never saw him demonstrate such a vicious, irrational side, so he'd gradually forgotten about that incident. Could this be the manifestation of yet another personality? He helplessly exchanged several blows with Yan Wushi. The current Yan Wushi wasn't Shun Chao's match, but the way he fought without regard for his life made Shun Chao apprehensive. There was no way Shun Chao could take his life, but to avoid being too loud and alarming the other guests in the inn, Shun Chao searched for an opportunity, then sealed his acupoints. Unable to fight back, Yan Wushi collapsed forward. Shun Chao quickly caught him, noticing as he did that his face was suddenly flushed red with blood. He rushed to feel his pulse and realized that Yan Wushi's internal energy was in chaos, rampaging through his body, a clear sign of qi deviation. Shocked despite himself, Shun Chao quickly undid his acupoint. But the moment he did, Yan Wushi abruptly seized Shun Chao's neck. Then he threw him closer and bit down on his lips. In pain, Shun Chao snaked his arm around Yan Wushi's neck and struck hard. The other man fell limply on top of him. It was finally quiet. Shun Chao let out a sigh of relief. He picked up Yan Wushi's wrist and felt it, then let out a gasp of surprise. If the man had just been in the throes of qi deviation earlier, then now, only a short time later, his pulse had completely calmed. In contrast, his life force even seemed to be thriving? Chapter 71. The Real Yan Wushi. Yan Wushi's current situation was 100 times more troublesome than Shun Chao's own had been back then. Shun Chao might have fallen off a cliff and sustained grave injuries, then been plagued with lingering illnesses, but that was due to Joyful Reunion's poison flaring up in his body. His damaged meridians had since been repaired by the Juyang strategy's true qi, and the remnant poison from Joyful Reunion had also dissolved when he destroyed his martial arts. Though his eyes were still affected and hadn't fully recovered, the Juyang strategy had already rebuilt his foundations. He had to completely relearn his martial arts, but all the disastrous factors within him were gone. But this wasn't true for Yan Wushi. The flaw in his demonic core had been there from the beginning. It was an innate problem. Guangling-san had even discovered it and exploited it using an ambush together with the other experts. He'd aggravated the flaw, and when combined with that head injury, Yan Wushi's entire body's meridians and internal breathing had fallen into disorder. This, in turn, affected his state of mind, causing massive changes to his personality. Therefore, they had to heal at least 3 things before he could recover. One was the head injury, which was no longer a problem now that they had the jade cistanche. Second was to sort out his meridians, and third was to patch his demonic core. The second and third were interlinked. Fixing one would fix the other. Each day the flaw remained unrepaired was a day with the risk of qi deviation or disordered meridians, and the problem with his meridians would also impede the recovery of his martial arts. Currently, the pulse Shun Chao was feeling might not be indicative of Yan Wushi's true situation. Rather, it could be a sign of calm without and a storm within. But it was at least a good start. After all, Yan Wushi was a blessed genius. Since he'd said that the silk piece could repair the flaw in his demonic core, it must be true. It was only a matter of time and effectiveness. Shun Chao laid him flat on the bed, then pulled a white item out of his sleeve. This was the jade cistanche that Xie Ling had given him back in Ruoqiang's ancient capital. The cuts the apes had left Shun Chao then were mostly healed, so he'd never consumed it. Though the jade cistanche could regulate qi and ease breathing, since he now had the assistance of Juyang strategy's true qi, it wasn't too useful for him. Shun Chao held the sistanch in his hand, then brought over an empty cup. With a squeeze, the sistanch's powder streamed down from between his fingers. Soon, it filled half the cup, and he added some warm water. Then he gripped Yan Wushi's chin and pried open his mouth before pouring in the sistanch water mixture. This object was exalted for its curative powers, so naturally, it possessed some miraculous effects. Even the imperial palaces normally wouldn't have any. One had to go somewhere beneath the Gobi Desert, like Ruoqiang's ancient city, to find one. That it was precious went without saying. Those apes feeding on them year in and year out had been granted incredible strength, and over the years, they'd even developed intelligence. That was why they'd been the martial artists' match in battle. At that time, Yan Wushi had plucked 4 fruits and discarded the rest in order to threaten Changong. Afterward, he'd eaten 2 himself, then given Shun Chao 1. He probably didn't imagine that, in the end, the last fruit would still end up being used on himself. If it had been anyone else, even if eating it themselves would have little effect, they probably still wouldn't give it to another person for free. After he drank the jade sistanch water mixture, Yan Wushi's complexion really did improve quite a bit. Shun Chao put down the cup and returned to meditating. At the same time, he pondered the matters concerning the Juyang strategy. The Juyang strategy had 5 volumes in total, and one of them was related to the martial arts from the demonic discipline. It was also precisely the contents of that silk that Yan Wushi had seized from Changong. Shun Chao had read it as well. Being only a couple thousand characters, it was concise yet profound, and the entire thing really was a commentary of Riyuesek's martial arts in the past. There wasn't any point in Shun Chao spending more time on it since he cultivated a Taoist core. It had nothing to do with him. Of the remaining 4 volumes that concerned the martial arts of the 3 schools, Shun Chao had read 2. One of them from his venerable master Qi Fengge, and the other inside Chu Yuan Temple. He'd recited the latter personally before everyone, then Yan Wushi had destroyed it. As for the 2 final volumes, one was hidden within Zhou's inner palace, and the other was in Tian Tai sect. Due to the Juyang strategy's reputation, everyone believed it to be the most wondrous book in the world, and they all vied to see it. Back then, Douyan Shan had managed to obtain the whereabouts of one scroll, so he'd ordered Deputy Leader Yuan Fuyi to purchase it from its owner, then bring it back to him under the pretense of escorting cargo. Who could have known that Yan Wushi would intercept and eventually end up destroying it? As a result, Douyan Shan hated Yan Wushi to the bone, so him joining in the ambush wasn't strange either. Anyone else would agree that Yan Wushi's actions deserved that kind of hate. However, though many knew the Juyang strategy to be great, they didn't actually know how it was great. They even assumed that some kind of pureless martial arts must be recorded within, where practicing it would make you number 1 in the world. Even Qi Fengge of the past and Yan Wushi in the present had been unable to decipher it completely. Only after Shun Chao lost his martial arts did he understand what was wondrous about the Juyang strategy, the ability to reconstruct foundations. The Juyang strategy's true Qi integrated the strengths of the 3 schools, so the practitioners started out a level higher than anyone else. Their breadth of vision was entirely different. Due to this, the level of their future achievements would naturally differ as well. However, even if numerous martial experts realized this, they still wouldn't throw away their martial arts to start over with the Juyang strategy. Furthermore, those who had already read the Juyang strategy would become too attached to it, so most of them wouldn't readily share it with others. Hence, when one took into account the entire world, the number of people who could truly understand the Juyang strategy's essence would probably be in the single digits. Currently, it was as if Shun Chao were standing halfway up a mountain. There, he had a sense of how vast the world was, that nothing was impossible. But he was still inferior to someone standing at the mountain's summit. Each of the Juyang strategy's volumes were complete and independent books by themselves. But ultimately, they were still connected to each other. So right now, he'd sometimes practice to a certain point and find that he didn't understand, that he couldn't find the answer, leaving him to fumble around on his own. Perhaps, once he finished reading the other 2 volumes, the situation would be completely turned around. The scroll hidden within Zhou's inner palace was still feasible. With how their previous meeting went, Yu and Yong might be willing to lend it to him. But Tiantai sects was much more difficult. The Buddhist and Taoist sects couldn't really be considered friendly with one another. The world sects were still fighting for dominance. Each supported their own enlightened ruler as they fought without end. Tiantai sect could never lend their treasure to an unrelated person without a good reason. Shunchao pondered this until it was past midnight, and he unknowingly grew drowsy, falling into a shallow sleep. Only once dawn's light broke through the early morning sky did he fully awaken. He hadn't slept deeply, but Shunchao had followed Taoist practices from childhood, so he'd always been disinterested in worldly matters. He'd never been met with any insurmountable obstacles and resolved to carry a clear conscience always. This naturally meant that he never spent days plagued with worry, so even if his sleep had been shallow, it was still restful. It was just that his past disinterest had carried a slight naivety. However, after experiencing all sorts of ups and downs, this naivety had gradually subsided. While he still treated people with some naked sincerity, he'd also slowly learned to differentiate people's thoughts and intentions. Thus, he was no longer so easily deceived. Even before he opened his eyes, he could sense when a gaze from the bed landed upon him. He already knew who it was without looking, but he didn't know which personality would be awakening with him this time. If he was as violent as the previous night, Shunchao would have to knock him unconscious again. Then he might as well rent a carriage and toss him inside before continuing their journey. That would save him a great deal of trouble too. Shunchao's thoughts turned quickly, and he slowly opened his eyes. They weren't far from each other. He could see the expression on the other man's face. But Yan Wushir's face was unruffled, his eyes unreadable. His heart gave a thump. "Sect Leader Yan?" he asked. He didn't look particularly happy. Yan Wushir smiled, his manner thoughtful. "What? You seem a little unhappy to see me." Shunchao's eyelids dropped a little. "Not at all. These women's clothes I have on, you put them on me, didn't you?" "Urgent matters require unorthodox methods," said Shunchao. "This also saves us from much scrutiny and will help Sect Leader Yan return to Chang'an soon." Yan Wushir didn't seem to mind. He even touched the bun on his head, then his sleeves, with great interest. Then he said to Shunchao, "If you're going to use a disguise, make it a good one. Most women have long fingernails, and even if they don't, they'll paint them. Otherwise, the moment an observant person sees how prominent my knuckles are, they'll immediately know that I'm a man disguised as a woman." The corner of Shunchao's mouth twitched as he thought, "How am I supposed to know something like that? I've never disguised myself as one before." But what he said was, "Sect Leader Yan is right. If you'd like some nail paint, I can purchase some for you." Yan Wushir raised an eyebrow and smiled. "You seem rather unwilling to talk to me. What's wrong? Xieling is but a fragment of my soul, yet you favor him so much and treat him so gently. But when it's me, you're so blunt instead. Could Ah Chao have forgotten which one is the real Yan Wushir?" When Shen Chao had made his decision to save Yan Wushir, he hadn't done it to make him repent, and certainly not to win his gratitude. Who could have known that Yan Wushir's personality would fracture? Him meeting Xieling and Yan had been entirely unexpected. Otherwise, he didn't wish to get involved with this person at all. Best if he could never see his face again. He eagerly anticipated it. Xieling is Xieling. Yan Wushir is Yan Wushir. No matter what happens, I could never dare to forget Sect Leader Yan, said Shunqiao coolly. Yan Wushir's gaze landed on his wounded lip, and he laughed in surprise. What? Did Xieling even forget how to kiss someone after losing most of my memories? He was so impatient he even bit you? Only with this reminder did Shun Qiao become aware of the slight pain in his lip. But as he'd never been good at sarcastic retorts, he simply remained silent and refused to answer. Yan Wushi didn't seem to mind. Instead, he continued while smiling, "Since we found the piece of silk, the day the flaw in my demonic core is repaired will soon arrive. I truly must thank you for this. If you hadn't brought me to Zhuoqiang, I could never have obtained that silk from Chenggong. Ah, Qiao, you repaying evil with virtue has even made me a little remorseful about delivering you to Sang Jingxing that day." He said he was remorseful, but his tone didn't carry the slightest bit of remorse at all. This was the real Yan Wushi. With his character and actions, even if he owed the entire world, he still would never feel any remorse. Even if they turned back time, he'd make the exact same choice in order to force out Shen Chao's last, uncrossable line. In the end, it was as Yan Wushi said. He didn't need friends, only opponents, and the opponent had to be his equal, someone capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with him. Everything else had been Shen Chao's miscalculations and his own wishful thoughts. How could Shen Chao not understand this point by now? So he didn't respond to Yan Wushi's words and instead asked about important matters. "Once we leave the royal capital for the Central Plains, the risk of your identity being exposed grows greater. With your current level of cultivation, you probably don't wish to confront the likes of Buddhist Master Xueting head-on. At least for now. Right now, everyone's bows are pointed at you. You're surrounded by enemies on all sides. If you are discovered, you'll be beset by endless troubles. But the journey back to Chang'an won't be a short one. So what did you plan to do?" Yan Wushi could see the lack of interest in his expression. It was obvious that Shen Chao didn't wish to follow his digressions, but that freshly injured lip ruined his aesthetic impression a little, like a statue of an immortal that had been stained with the dust of the secular world. Yan Wushi immediately found it entertaining and continued his mockery. "You have no connection with the Northern Zhou. Surely a single meeting with Yuan Yong isn't enough for you to willingly stand by him and help me? Let me guess. Perhaps you've harbored some secret feelings for me since long ago? Then I broke your heart by handing you to Sang Jingxing, but you couldn't let go of those old feelings, and Xieling's appearance rekindled them. You even had me wear a woman's outfit. Maybe you wanted to take advantage of the times where I'm delirious in order to do something irreversible to me, so as long as to make me pledge myself to you?" Even with Shen Chao keeping a serious demeanor, Yan Wushi's narcissistic comments still left him reeling and at a loss. "If Sect Leader Yan is unwilling to discuss the important things, then I can just knock you unconscious and deliver you to Chang'an that way. It does not make a difference to me." Yan Wushi sputtered a laugh. All right. Don't be mad. We won't head straight back to Chang'an. Wei Province first. He'd always been capricious. In the past, during his good moods, it wasn't uncommon to see him beaming or coaxing others tenderly. Shen Chao frowned. "Why?" "Like you said, my martial arts have yet to recover, and my reappearance would be far too ostentatious. The Liu He Guild, the Buddhists, Huanyue sect, Fajing sect, and even the Khaganate, all of them want me dead. You won't be able to protect me with your current abilities." "And whose fault is that?" thought Shen Chao. "You have enemies everywhere, and that's not something everyone can pull off. If not for my concern over the big picture, which prevents me from picking a bone with you, I, too, would have joined the ranks of people trying to kill you." Yan Wushi couldn't hear his silent criticism, but Shen Chao's expression betrayed his thoughts. Yan Wushi found this greatly amusing. He stared at him for a long while, then finally asked, "Has there been any news from Chang'an?" "I heard that the Northern Zhou army marched right in without a challenge. Northern Qi didn't have the strength to resist. If everything went as expected, they should have already taken Yecheng." Yan Wushi made a sound of agreement. "I've arranged for some people to stay by Yuan Yong. He should be fine for the time being. If something does happen, we won't make it in time, even if we rush there now. Huanyue sect has an official residence in Wei Province. Let's stop there first, then find a way to send a message to Chang'an." Since he'd already decided, Shen Chao didn't object. "Then you rest for a while first," he said. "Where are you going?" "To buy you nail paint." For the first time in his life, Yan Wushi was rendered speechless. The two of them stayed in Tuyu Huan's capital for a few days before setting off for northern Zhou. Before they left, Shun Qiao had secretly taken a trip to Bana's house. Chen Gong had kept his promise. Her grandfather truly had returned. Grandfather and grandchild were both safe and sound. Only then did Shun Qiao's heart settle down, and he quietly turned and left. Yan Wushi's personality still showed signs of instability, but his mind was clear more often. Shun Qiao noticed that the first personality to be reintegrated was the violent one that attacked him at the first hint of disagreement. The other three personalities rarely came out during the day, but they'd alternate showing up at night. In other words, during the daytime, Yan Wushi was no different from his past self. However, whenever Xie Ling emerged, he always showed great dependence on Shun Qiao, to the point that he refused to sleep the entire night in favor of watching him. This was something the original Yan Wushi had no control over. Hence, Yan Wushi spent most of his daytime rather fatigued, and he often needed to meditate for rest. In early February, they arrived at the capital of Wei Province, and the crisis, too, had quietly crept closer. Chapter 72. Wei Province Capital. Wei Province had been established during the Northern Wei Dynasty. It was located at the source of the Wei River, hence the name Wei Province. In reality, the seat of its local government was called Xiangwu, but everyone had long gotten used to associating it with Wei River, so they referred to it as Wei Province Capital. The city couldn't compare with Chang'an, but it was still a city of strategic importance for the western areas. If war broke out between northern Zhou and Tuyu Huan, it would be at the front lines. Still, this danger didn't exist for the time being. Spring had yet to arrive, and the weather hadn't warmed, which meant fewer traveling merchants. So Wei Province's capital was as calm and tranquil as ever. Early in the morning, Ah Qing walked to the entrance holding a broom. It just snowed yesterday, so naturally he had to clear it properly. Otherwise, Uncle Wu would probably slip and fall when he went out for groceries later. He hummed an off-key tune that only he could follow, thinking that he had to quickly clear away the snow. He also needed to head to the backyard and check if that orange cat was there. The last couple of days, it'd often run into the woodshed to hide from the cold. If it was there, he'd bring it something to eat. After the heavy snowfall yesterday, the entrance was unsurprisingly blanketed in a thick layer of snow. Sometimes, mounds of snow would slide from the roofs with a soft splat. By this time, Ah Qing had already given the courtyard a thorough slip. There was a faint sheen of sweat over his skin, but he didn't feel cold, just a little breathless. He stopped to rest for a while. He automatically looked up when he saw two people walking toward him from the street. Ah Qing first noticed the man in blue. He was still a distance away, so he couldn't see his face clearly, but just his movements and demeanor gave off an aura of someone extraordinary. Ah Qing found it hard to find a fitting word to describe him. He could only think of the cold rice pudding he often ate during the summer, snow white and translucent, cool and refreshing. Just looking at it would give him a sense of indescribable soothing, let alone finishing it. As the man walked over, he realized that his association with cool rice pudding was truly most fitting. Ah Qing had never seen such a handsome man before. For a moment, he was stunned, still staring, until he noticed that those two people were walking toward him, getting closer and closer. Only then did he quickly return to himself. Cold rice pudding, no. The man carrying the long cloth bag walked up to him, cupping his hands at Ah Qing. May I ask if this is the Xie residence? In the past, Ah Qing would have definitely replied, the words Xie residence are right up there, and real big too. Are you blind? Can't you read? Why ask the obvious? But he didn't say those caustic words. He even blushed instead. His usual witty speech seemed to have flown away. He actually stammered, but I don't know you. Is this gentleman also a member of this residence? The man asked politely with a smile. Ah Qing felt like half of the bones in his body had gone limp. Right at that moment, a sneer came from beside the man in blue. Ah Xiao, If you're going to ask that slowly, when will we finally get our answer? Just call Lao Wu out. Tell him that his master has returned. Only then did Ah Qing pay attention to the woman in yellow who accompanied the man in blue. She wore a veil, so he couldn't see her face. However, most women near the border were slender, while slender couldn't be used to describe this lady at all. She pretty much possessed the height and figure of a man, which was truly a rare sight. On top of that, though her voice wasn't unpleasant, it also lacked the mellow gentleness common to women. Ah Qing was bewildered for a moment. Did you make a mistake? We don't have a master here. The Lord of Xie residence left to travel a couple years ago, and he's yet to return. Shen Qiao was about to inquire further when he saw Yan Wushi toss the youth something. Ah Qing caught it and looked down. It was a piece of yellow jade, less than half the size of his palm, but the engravings upon it were exquisite. The bright moon over cassia branches, together with the mist-cloaked Kunlun mountains. Give it to Wu Mi and have him come see me, said the woman who wasn't like a woman at all. Ah Qing suddenly shivered, remembering what Uncle Wu had told him before. He realized just who the person standing before him was. He turned without another word and ran inside, closing the gates in the process and locking Shen Qiao and Yan Wushi outside. He was surprisingly vigilant, but he lacked the proper training. His various actions would only look childish in the eyes of others. The two of them stood outside for a long time before the gates opened once more. An old man of around 60 years came out, the youth from before following behind him. The old man's gaze swept past Shen Qiao and landed on Yan Wushi, still wearing the veil. "Master?" he asked doubtfully. Yan Wushi gave him a sound of confirmation. Only one sound, but it was unmistakable to the old man. He was so overjoyed, he almost rushed forward to bow, but after taking a couple of steps, he managed to restrain himself and quickly let them inside instead. Come in, we can talk afterward." Ah Qing followed behind Uncle Wu and scrutinized the two people curiously. He wasn't from Huanyue sect, but an orphan whom Uncle Wu had taken in at a young age. Since then, he stayed inside his small house to keep Uncle Wu company and help him with housework. Uncle Wu hadn't told him much, but Ah Qing vaguely understood that this house did have a master and that Uncle Wu was only looking after it for him. But they didn't know where the master was or even when he'd return. Perhaps he'd return in a couple of years, or perhaps he wouldn't return in their lifetime. Before, Ah Qing had assumed that the master who was traveling far away, as Uncle Wu put it, had probably passed away in some accident already. Never had he thought that this man would suddenly appear before them one day, and dressed as a woman even. "Ah Qing," Uncle Wu called to him, "go to the kitchen and prepare some congee, then make a few side dishes. Master is back from what was surely a long and arduous journey, so he must eat something to warm up first." "Ah, I'm going." Ah Qing dutifully listened to Uncle Wu. He agreed at once and quickly scampered off. Yan Wushi glanced at his retreating back, then removed his veil. "His foundations aren't bad, but he's a little stupid. Huanyue sect needs people who are agile of mind and excellent with people. He doesn't qualify." Uncle Wu quickly replied, "My lowly self only took him in because I was bored, so I let him accompany me. I could never think such presumptuous thoughts." Originally, this house was one of Huanyue sect's bases. Bian Yanmei had purchased it in his name, and because the aliases of Huanyue sect's disciples all used the surname Xie, these houses were collectively known as Xie residences. Uncle Wu oversaw this one, and after several years together, he'd indeed grown to love Ah Qing a little and had thought about giving him the opportunity to enter Huanyue sect. However, he would never dare to bring such an idea to Yan Wushi. Originally, he'd wanted to wait until Bian Yanmei or Yu Shengyan came over to make his request. He could never have expected that neither of the two would show up, and instead the great Buddha himself had. Now he dared not even mention it. Shen Qiao suddenly said, "Being stupid means that worldly possessions won't easily tempt him, and it doesn't necessarily mean he can't put his heart into practicing martial arts. I find that child pure and simple myself, which is very good. If he has no connections to Huanyue sect and is willing to learn martial arts, I can recommend him instead. At that moment, he was thinking of Bixia sect. After that terrible incident, their sect had waned greatly, and even finding gifted young successors wasn't easy. Yan Wushi was a grandmaster with sky-high expectations, so he might think little of Ah Qing's talents, but the boy could still have a bright future in Bixia sect. Yan Wushi burst out with a chuckle. Oh, Ah Qiao, I haven't seen you take such a liking to anyone our entire trip. If we are talking about talent and foundations, wasn't the boy we encountered earlier on the road better? Surely you aren't only saying this because you saw how he kept staring at you, infatuated with your face, hmm? Sect Leader Yan, just because you yourself are lustful, you believe everyone else to be the same as you. Before, he hadn't wanted to pay attention to Yan Wushi, because whenever they argued, he lost more than he won. So whenever Yan Wushi returned to his original self, he'd try to limit how much he talked to him. But while he'd endured it the whole journey, he finally lost it here. Rather predictably, Yan Wushi laughed. Lust is a hunger, part of human nature. Everyone is like this. It's true that I like your face, but I love your cold indifference to me more. What's wrong with admitting that? You're so gentle towards Xie Ling and Ah Yan, but you won't even say half a word to me when I appear. Still, in the end, both Xie Ling and Ah Yan are just facets of me, Yan Wushi. And if Xie Ling and Ah Yan were using Wu Mi's old face instead and tried to approach you that way, would you still treat them with the same special favor? The innocent Uncle Wu had been dragged into this mess. He couldn't figure out Shun Qiao and Yan Wushi's relationship, so he didn't dare speak and just gave a strained smile. Shun Qiao made a non-committal sound. It's true that just seeing you annoys me. I'd rather speak even more to Xie Ling than talk to you. Though Yan Wushi was still smiling, that smile had become somewhat dangerous. Uncle Wu wanted to leave, yet couldn't. But staying around was terribly awkward. As he listened to them talk, he wished that he could turn invisible. In the past, he'd followed Yan Wushi for a while. He knew that every time the man revealed this smile, someone was going to suffer. But surprisingly, after the smile was gone, Yan Wushi said gently, "All right, let's just say I misspoke. I let you dress me up like a woman for the entire journey without complaint, and I did my best to cooperate. Is that still not enough to earn some good humor from you? Our great sect leader Shun is magnanimous. I trust you won't hold it against me." With how arrogant the Huanyue sect leader was, how many people had ever seen him lower himself and apologize? Not only was Uncle Wu alarmed, even Shun Qiao was somewhat surprised. Though Shun Qiao didn't reply, when he opened his mouth again, his tone had softened slightly. "You and Uncle Wu must have much to discuss. I won't disturb you any longer. If there are any guest rooms, I'd like to rest a while." Seeing that Yan Wushi didn't object, Uncle Wu quickly said, "There are. We keep them tidy all throughout the year, so they're always ready for guests. I'll take your esteemed self there." He took Shun Qiao over and helped him settle in, then rushed back to pay respects to Yan Wushi. "What good fortune that the sect leader is safe and sound. This lowly one heard that you were... I didn't dare believe it. It was just a rumor." Yan Wushi sneered. "Not really a rumor. I indeed sustained some injuries and have yet to fully recover." "Ah," said Uncle Wu. "Then the man just now was..." "His family name is Shun," said Yan Wushi. "While he's here, treat him as you would treat me." Uncle Wu quickly gave his assent, too afraid to ask further. "What's been happening outside lately?" asked Yan Wushi. "News of your death has already spread through the Jianghu," said Uncle Wu. "This lowly one refused to believe it and even sent a message to Chang'an, but Da Langjun has yet to reply. Word is that He Huan sect has taken the chance to cause us many problems, but this lowly one remembered your instructions. I've cautiously kept a low profile, so this location remains a secret." "What about you and Yong?" "The Lord of Zhou personally went to battle, then vanquished Qi. Right now, his reputation is at its peak, like the sun at high noon. Even the Kaghanate and Southern Chun fear a direct confrontation with him. After the Lord of Zhou heard the news about you, he apparently sent men to torment your murderers. But only the Liu He Guild had surface forces that could be tracked down. The whereabouts of the rest are unknown. Their various sects aren't within Zhou, and the Lord of Zhou isn't someone in the Jianghu either. The power of the imperial court wasn't enough. In the end, he could only seal off several of the Liu He Guild's branches within Zhou. When did you send the message to Chang'an? Asked Yan Wushi. Last year, on the 25th of the final month. Sending a letter and receiving a reply did take some time, but it was also possible that something had happened with Bian Mei. I'll stay for a few days and wait for a response from Chang'an. Go and make arrangements. Make sure no unrelated persons leak any information. Uncle Wu hastily said, Yes, Master can rest assured. Ah Qing doesn't know this lowly one's identity, but that child is good at keeping secrets, and his background is clean. He definitely won't cause any trouble. He personally brought Yan Wushi to his room to rest. As Uncle Wu left the backyard, he saw Ah Qing walking over with the freshly made food. Uncle, this food is ready. Should I take it to them now? Uncle Wu nodded. Remember not to say too much. Don't ask about things you shouldn't. Chattering on in front of me is fine, but you can't do that in front of Master. He dislikes people who are talkative. Ah Qing promised, but then he couldn't resist asking curiously, Uncle, is your master, the lord of this house, are they a man or a woman? Uncle Wu's face went dark. Of course he's a man. You can't even tell men and women apart? How should I know? Ah Qing muttered. Maybe he has some special hobbies. I found the gentleman who came with him much easier to get along with. Though his voice was very quiet, Uncle Wu still heard him, and he sent the boy a smack on the back of the head. What are you muttering? Hurry up and bring them their food, and keep quiet. Those who talk too much err the most. Don't you know that silence is golden? Ow! All right, everyone. That concludes the reading of chapters 68 through 72. I don't really have much to say about this one, other than, of course, I am still enjoying the many different facets of Yan Wushi, Yan Wushi, Yan Wushi, and Yan Wushi. Also, it was quite interesting to see Yan Wushi admit that he was wrong in just that last little bit there. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I've been loving getting these little snippets or little splurges of Shen Chao's inner thoughts that have so much sass. And he definitely has been a little bit more sassy verbally as well. But sometimes I'm like, man, what you're saying in your head, I just want you to say out loud. But he's so adorable. Oh my gosh, I love Shen Chao so much.